I think the weather's just been funny. Sunny the one moment and then cloudy the next. But yeah, this is Cape Town weather, and I think we're used to it by now. Cool, so I think we'll get started. Thank you for everyone who's already been putting their student numbers in the chat. Just get my screen up. All right, so we will be continuing from our session on Monday. As you guys know, we left off on Unit 6. Yes, Unit 6 of the study unit. Yeah, and I suppose we are all familiar with the sort of the rules of engagement of our sessions. I'm not going to maybe spend time on that. I'll just encourage you to, if there's anything you do want to say, any comments or questions, I will always encourage engagement. So please feel free to chip in and type a comment in the chat box, or raise the hand so that yeah, you can unmute your mic and then we can hear your thoughts or your questions. And then we do have the one-on-one consultation still. I believe as we are approaching exam time that these may be quite helpful for you guys. So yeah, just a reminder that I am available for those as well. Okay, so we'll just do a quick recap of Monday's session. And we looked at sampling in our sort of our journey through our research stages. Sampling was then the last one that we looked at. Sorry, just trying to find that. Right. So we said that essentially. Oh, sorry about that. Okay. So yes, we say that sampling really is this method or selecting a certain group of people to represent a wider population, and we went through a few basic concepts in sampling. Yes, so our sample is really a subset of a population, and what we said the population is the broader group of people that we are wanting to study. So if we're wanting to study, all nurses, or if our study is about nurses in South Africa, then our population is all the nurses in South Africa, right? But of course, for practical reasons, we are not able to access all the nurses in South Africa. So we would therefore need to get a sample which we can then go about and interview or observe or ask questions to, so that we can then gain so we can get responses from them that we would be able to generalize to the wider nursing population, right? So we talked about a few basic concepts, such as, and I think it's important that we note and really understand what these different concepts mean. So we looked at population, we looked at element, we looked at parameter, what the parameters are. We looked at sample, the definition of a sample. We looked at that. We looked at what a sampling frame is, and then we looked at a representative sample, what that means, why that is so important in our discussions around sampling. If you remember, we said that the key characteristic of a sample is that it needs to be representative, and that essentially means that it needs to resemble the population. So if our population holds certain characteristics, then our sample needs to have the same characteristics. Otherwise, we're not able to generalize accurately, because how do you generalize about nurses and you've gone out and your sample consisted of teachers, you know, you're not going to get the information about nurses that you needed to get. Yeah, so I wonder if anyone can maybe break down to us quite briefly the relation between population, sample, element, and parameter. If we remember, I think if we remember what the definitions of these terms are, we see how they relate to each other or how they all come together to put one big picture together. Any takers? So I've already mentioned our definition of a population and a sample. So essentially, what is an element? What is a parameter? Is essentially what I'm asking. Okay, Amy says a parameter is a measure of value collected from a population. Is it collected from the population, or is it? Or is it inherently a part of the population? I think what we wanted to ask. So the parameter is actually your characteristics of the population. So essentially, or your criteria of the criteria of your population. So, for example, our population is nurses, right? Nurses in South Africa. So what are the parameters? If you think of parameters, we're thinking. I remember we said we're thinking of a borders around a particular thing. So we really want to define what the borders are of our population. Otherwise, you say all nurses, and that's, you know, it's very broad. So you would then put a sort of parameters, or you would put borders around what nurses in particular we're looking at. So we'd say registered nurses. So registered is then a parameter of our population, or a characteristic of our population, right? Registered nurses or registered male nurses. So they must be registered, they must be male, and they must be nurses. These are our parameters, or the characteristics of our population. All right. And then we went on to talk about the two types or two approaches to sampling. The first being probability sampling. We looked at a number of probability sampling methods there. Sorry. And we said really that probability sampling, oh no, before I go into that, we looked at the essentials of sampling, and we talked about homogeneous versus heterogeneous groups. And I hope that we remember the definitions of those and what that means. Okay, yes. So basically the nurses are the unit from the population, yes. So the nurses would, the individual person that you get is your element or your unit, right? So one nurse is one element of your population, or one unit of your population. And then the fact that they are male registered nurse is the parameter. So each of those identifying characteristics, yes, are parameters. So registered is a parameter, nurse is a parameter, male is a parameter. If we add an age bracket there, then we say between 25 to 30 is a parameter. So all of those are the characteristics essentially that we're looking for. And in this way, we're basically defining our population. We're saying who exactly is the focus of our study and who exactly we will be looking for when we go out and look for samples. Okay, so then we looked at probability and non-probability sampling approaches. We say that in probability sampling, essentially everyone, or another way to remember probability sampling is to call it random sampling, and that helps us to understand that if something is random, it means that anything goes essentially, and that anyone has a chance of being selected to be a part of the sample. So it's a really random selection at this point. Whereas with non-probability, it's not, the chances aren't the same. So it's very specific people that will get chosen to form part of the sample. So within probability sampling or random sampling, we looked at simple random sampling. We looked at systematic sampling, stratified random sampling, and cluster sampling, right? So maybe for the benefit of those who were not with us, simple random sampling, as the words say, it really is very simple. Sort of the most basic way to select people randomly is sort of an eeny, meeny, miny, mo type of approach, except we don't do eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Something like a fishbowl method or a lottery method where, numbers or all the elements are ascribed a number or a unit, and that is added in a bowl, and then whoever gets selected, we just pick from the bowl, and it's completely random. So whoever gets selected, so anyone really has a chance of getting selected if your number gets picked, right? Can anyone remind us about systematic sampling? It's also called interval sampling. Taking a group of elements and drawing every 5th or 10th element from a population. Exactly. So we call it the nth, so small n, th. So we draw every nth element just because, we don't know what that number is going to be until the researcher, of course, has done the necessary calculations to determine what number that's going to be. But yes, essentially you've got your group, your population, and you decide, you do the calculation, you decide, okay, I'm going to choose every 10th person in this population, and and from there it's still random because there's really no chance of knowing who the 10th person will be. So it's still random, it's still a probability, but it's a lot more systematic because you're not just choosing at random. There's actually a system to how you're choosing it, so I think the name speaks for itself, but it's also called interval sampling. I think that's what it is in the study unit. So that's also another way to remember that there's an interval to which every sampling element is selected. Okay, I'm just gonna move on quickly. And then we have stratified random sampling and cluster sampling, which are very similar, but really is where you take your population and you divide them into two groups, and then you select from the group. So with stratified random sampling, we divide them into similar groups. For example, if I have nurses, and my study is, on just nurses in general, I would then first divide them into female nurses and male nurses, and then within each of those strata or each of those groups, I would then select at random. I would select at random people from each group. And then cluster sampling, similar, but two groups are not the same. So in stratified, they're all female, right? So it's a homogeneous group. But with the cluster, it's quite different. So it would be, an example would be, instead of saying I'm going to divide them between male and female, I say I'm going to divide them between people with 2 years experience, and then the other group is people with 4 years, 2 to 4 years experience. So the group in itself is quite different. There's only perhaps that one thing that makes them similar, which is how many years of experience they have, but everything else about them is different. Okay, so that's our probability sampling. Elements are also selected at equal intervals. Yes, for systematic samplings, they are selected at equal intervals. So, and then we looked at non-probability sampling, and non-probability really, if we're saying it's the opposite of random sampling, is that it's a bit more intentional how we go about collecting or choosing our samples. Right, so the first one we had, it was convenience sampling, and this is just, as the word say, I select whoever is most convenient for me. So if I walked into a hospital and say I wanted to interview these nurses, I'm going to select probably the first 5 nurses that I get. Then I'm going to take them because they are most convenient. Or accidentals, like if you just run into someone, right? An accidental running. So whoever you access is who you use. And of course, there are lots of issues around this, but we did go through it on Monday. And if you want a refresher, I'll just encourage you to go back and read that section in the study unit. Then we looked at quota or purposive sampling, and this is more judgmental. So the researcher is actually specifically looking for certain types of people. So you're trying to meet a quota. You're trying to make sure that these people meet a certain criteria. So yeah, you would go ahead and make sure, I'm looking for specifically 25-year-old male nurses. So then you go and you actually approach the people that you feel actually fit your criteria, as opposed to I'll just take the first 5 male nurses that I get, right? You're a bit more intentional about who you want to be part of the study. And then we've got the snowball sampling, which is the last one, which is like a snowball. If you've selected you get your elements or your participants, and after interviewing them, you sort of ask them to recommend more people who meet the same criteria. And the sort of the rationale here is that people with, in certain groups would have more access to their peers, for example. So a 25-year-old male nurse probably will have a friend who is also a 25-year-old male nurse, right? So from there you can ask him to recommend, and that one will recommend the next one, that one will recommend the next one. So it's like a snowball. It just keeps going. All right, and then finally we looked at sample sizes, and we said that there are quite a few factors that the researcher needs to take into consideration when thinking about the sample size. It is up to the researcher, of course, to decide how many people they want in their sample, but you need to be mindful of, the size of your sample versus things like the size of your population, how much time you have, what method you're going to use to collect the data. All of this will determine how many people you can actually have in your sample. All right. Are there any questions on sampling? All right, so I think that we are all together there. So we'll move on to today's session. And we're looking at study unit 7, which is data collection. For the purpose of time, I've decided to split two because it is quite a lengthy unit, and I thought it would it would be a disservice to try to rush through that entire unit in one session. So I have split it up. We'll do the first part today, and of course we'll continue on Monday with the second part. So yes, we're looking at data collection, and from our discussions up to this point, I believe that it's clear for us to see that you social science researchers are really out here trying to find the answer to issues. So how then are they going to go about getting these answers? It's through data, right? We need to collect data. So in this unit, we're looking at how do we collect this data? What are the methods that you would use as a social science researcher to collect the relevant data to be able to answer whatever research question you have? So there are three ways in which we collect data, or three methods that are used in data collection. And the first is measuring, then we've got questioning, and we've got observation. And we'll go into each of these. Okay, we'll go into each of these in this session. So it's important to note that although we deal with these three data collection methods separately, they are often used in combination. So you might find that one study will have, measuring elements, but it will also have observation elements, or it might have all three elements included in the one study. So it's not mutually exclusive, essentially. All right. So let's just move on here. So if we're starting off with measurements, for those who are following along with me in the study unit, we are on page, just get there, page 171. Yeah. Cool. So if we start with measurement, measurements help us to measurement is really when we record or register the value of a particular variable. And what we mean is we want to really identify quantify. We're really trying to quantify a variable to give it some sort of value that we can then use in our analysis. So it must be valid and it must be reliable, right? And it also helps us to describe the variable that we have identified. So there are a number of levels of measurement that we can look at, from something very basic like nominal level to something a little bit more, a bit more complex, like the ratio level. So I'll just break it down quickly. The nominal level really, at its core, is, if we think of nominal, we think of naming, we think of, naming things. So the nominal is where you're actually breaking down your variables in a way that is that is discrete, mutually exclusive, and exhaustive. So when we say by discrete, it's like we've taken a category and we're asking respondents to choose, from an option, from a list of choices. So the discrete being then that the choices are all different from each other, right? So we've asked them, do you like apples, bananas, or pears? Apples are very different to bananas, and bananas are very different to pears. So that's what we say. They're discrete or they're distinct from each other. Another example of a discrete category is we are told in the study unit something like pregnancy. So we can ask so it's either someone is pregnant or they're not pregnant, and we can categorize them accordingly. You can't be almost pregnant or a little bit pregnant or, something like that. So it has to be one or the other. It can't, you can't be both. So then it has to be mutually exclusive. And when we're saying that mutually exclusive, it really means we can't measure it by other categories. For example, if it's are you pregnant, yes or no? If it's yes, it can't be no. Or if it's no, it can't be yes, right? So it has to be one or the other, which it's mutually exclusive. Therefore, choosing one category automatically excludes another category, essentially. And then finally, it has to be exhaustive, which means you've included all the options or all the categories in the list. So, for example, if you ask someone, which of the South African languages do you speak? You need to then have listed all the South African languages in that so that people can choose accordingly. Otherwise, if it's an incomplete list, then it's not exhaustive, right? Then we can't categorize accurately. Just see if there's a question here. Okay. So that's the nominal level. It's sort of the most basic level, and it's the one that we probably come across the most, that and the ordinal level. So ordinal level, if we think of the root word, there's order. So it's something that is being ranked. So in the ordinal level, the researcher basically ranks the data in order of importance, essentially. So if you're asking someone their opinion on something, you would ask them usually from a range of how strongly they agree with something to if they don't agree, right? And if you think of surveys that you've done or forms that you filled out, questionnaires that you filled out, where you're asked, to answer according to the scale, the Likert scale. So it's either you strongly disagree, you disagree, neutral, agree, or strongly agree. So it's an order by which they can categorize your responses or your attitude towards a particular phenomena. So it must be ranked. So I think a good way to remember that ordinal level is something that is in order, something that is being ranked. So you can see it just by ranking of importance or by order of most important or least important, or most helpful to least helpful. So they tell us that this is quite good for collecting data around attitudes or opinions on things, because you can really see across the range. Instead of asking someone, do you like this lecture, you could ask them, how useful did you find the lecture? And then they can actually give you on this continuum or on the scale, like where it stands, and it gives you a more nuanced view of people's attitudes towards this particular thing. Right. Yes, so we're told that ordinal scales are frequently used to measure behaviors, attitudes, opinions, and preferences. And then the next thing we have is the interval level. And sorry, let me just see question. Is that similar to schematic differential scale? Yes, it is. It is similar. Is it? Cool. And then the interval. Yes. So interval level is similar to the nominal and ordinal level, except that with the interval level, you can measure the interval or the distance between the 2 points. So for example, if we look at nominal, we can't really measure the difference between banana and apple. We can't really measure the distance, the interval or the difference between being pregnant and not being pregnant, or strongly agree to strongly I strongly agree to agree. We can't really measure that because there's no absolute zero. So that's where interval zero comes. Sorry. Yes. Sorry, just rewind that. Yes, so we can't exactly measure the difference, but with the interval scale or with the interval level, it's the kind of data that allows us to see the differences between each category, right? Each level of data. So if it's something like a thermometer and you're measuring temperature, you can clearly see the difference between someone with a temperature of 36 degrees and someone with a temperature of 38 degrees. You can sort of calculate that difference there. So you'd see that this then is more suitable for quantitative or data that is more numerical in nature, right? But the thing we're told here, though, is that the interval scale does not have an absolute zero, so we're not really sure where it starts. Or, yeah, even if we do know, okay, obviously temperatures, actually temperatures don't start at zero. So, yeah, there's no 0 point, essentially. So this is then where we get to a more advanced level of measurement, which is with the ratio level, which is regarded as the highest level of measurement, because it includes everything basically that we've discussed. That means it is discrete, it's mutually exclusive, it's exhaustive, the data is being ranked, we can see the intervals, right? We can clearly calculate the intervals between them, but the added feature then here is that it has an absolute zero, so we know what the starting point is, and we're able to calculate accordingly from that. So something that is used, that we would use a ratio scale for, we are told, is something like weight, because there's an absolute zero with weight, length and time. These are things that are quantified, so we can say that, okay, from 0.0, this is then what this weight is, and we can calculate that accordingly, right? So it's when we know when we know the lowest possible value is when we're able to use a ratio level of measurement. I think the important thing to note here was we don't necessarily have to actually do any of the calculations. I think the important thing to know is just that these key characteristics of each of the levels of measurement, how they differ from each other, and this is, so what I've highlighted in the slide here is to just see these key characteristics of each level of measurement. And just remembering that when it comes to the ratio level, it basically includes everything at the top, plus the fact that it has an absolute zero. So it makes it a lot more sophisticated than the other levels of measurements. Right. And then we talk about measurement errors just because as with everything in life, there are room for errors, and errors do occur. And so similarly, when we're collecting data in social research, we should be aware that measuring instruments that we use could bias the actual data. So it basically could compromise the quality of the data that we collect. And so we are told that there are two sources of measurement error, namely systematic errors and random errors. So a systematic error essentially is an error that occurs constantly, right? So it occurs constantly and it distorts the measurement in a particular direction. So for example, if we're asking participants how they feel about smoking, no, maybe not smoking, what their thoughts are on child trafficking, or something that people might have opposing views, but then they are actually scared. I think that's not a good example, excuse me, but yeah, just a topic which people might feel some shame about actually supporting or not supporting. So in that case, you ask them that kind of question, they may just answer in a way that they feel is more socially acceptable, and not necessarily the way that how they really feel about something. So in that case, that becomes a systematic error, because you're not getting the real data, or the real data, or the person's real attitudes towards a particular thing, right? So you're not getting the true opinions, which ultimately means your data is compromised. But I mean, unfortunately, it's one of these things. Yes, exactly. Social desirability responses. So it's one of those things you can't really shy away from, because everyone, I think it's human nature for people to want to present themselves in a particular way. So if you ask someone, what would you do if, someone cut in line in front of you, what they probably will do is, maybe push the person off or yell at the person, but they want to be perceived in a particular way. So they'll say, oh no, I'll just leave it, something like that. And in that way, that's not not accurate, but it's not a true reflection of that person, what that person would do. So in that case, I suppose the research has failed to measure what they intended to measure, because you're not getting the true responses from participants. Right, so that's a systematic error. And then we have a random error, and they say that a random error really is one of those, as the name suggests, it's random, it happens by chance, it's a mistake that can happen due to anything, from the circumstances to misunderstanding on the participants, misunderstanding on the researcher side, maybe something failed, the recording device may have failed. So, all these things which will basically distort your data are these things that we can call then random errors, right? So some other examples of factors that directly influence measurement consistency, we are told, is that if some respondents are tired or ill, immediately, if someone is sick, they're not going to perform at their best. They're not going to respond at their best, because your brain isn't really in that space to think too much or to really reflect, especially if it's a difficult issue, or if it's a long interview or a long questionnaire and you're feeling sick, you just want to get it over with. So maybe you'll just say, oh, I'll just tick number one for everything, So that, of course, will distort the data. Number two is if some respondents find the presence of the researcher threatening. And we talked about this when we talked about something called the Hawthorne effect. I hope we still remember that. So when we talked about the Hawthorne effect, so, I suppose it goes back to it's similar to a systematic error, right? So you want to respond in a socially acceptable manner. So you feel like the researcher's presence then starts affecting how you're going to respond. So that distorts your data as well. And then we say that if the researcher has a momentary lapse in concentration, so yeah, I think that is straightforward. If the researcher was making notes and then, they zoned out a bit, they, in that case, would have then lost some pertinent information, which will now not be reflected in their write-up. And then if for example, the researcher's equipment, like a tape recorder or something, if that malfunctioned. So essentially, these random errors, they can influence our measurement or our data, but they normally occur by chance. So it's not something that you really, as a researcher, have full control over. All right. If there are any questions, please feel free to just pop them in the chat. Okay, so moving on, we talk about using existing data. So I think when we think of data collection, our initial thought is that, okay, I'm going to go out and collect data, right? I'm going to go out, I'm going to interview people, I'm going to send out surveys. But in some cases, researchers they don't actually go out to the field, or they don't physically go and collect data because they have a space where there is existing data that they can use for their analysis. So we are told that researchers do not necessarily need to actually observe or question people, but they can use existing data to answer a new question or a problem, right? So when we're talking about existing data, of course, it's data that was already collected by someone else, or maybe by the same researcher, but now that data is going to be used in a new way, I suppose, or interpreted or analyzed in a new way or in a new angle. So the purpose of the research and the nature of the problem will determine whether and which existing data ought to be used, it will be used. So, for example, if I am wanting to do research on, how people feel about Facebook and their privacy issues. I could go and interview people, but maybe there's a thread somewhere online already where a bunch of people have actually put their opinions. Maybe there was an article written and up to 1,000 people have commented on that, talking about their opinions. That's existing data, right? So I don't need to go and actually now speak to people, interview people, because the data is right there. So I could use that. Of course, an example like that poses questions around ethics and, how do you get the consent of people? But I think for the sake of the study unit, we say we're working with the assumption that we have the right to use the existing data, right? So existing data can be things like films, movies, documentaries. If you're wanting to do your research on a documentary, that data exists already. On newspaper, reportings of an event that was done already. Journals, existing research, you can use existing research as your data collection for your research. Official documents like, the Schools Policy Act or the Children's Act, things like that, that can be used as data. So it really depends on what your research is about and what field you're in. For example, I know in the legal field, they don't necessarily go out and interview people, right? They use cases as their data in their research papers, and then they analyze a case. But that's an example of existing data. So there are a few advantages that we are told to collecting and using existing data. The first one is, and I suppose these are quite common sense if we think about them. So the first one is that the method is unobtrusive. So we're not directly involving anyone. So we're not really bothering anyone with asking for information, collecting data. So we're not influencing the participants or respondents because there are no participants and respondents, right? Number two, the method is practical. Obviously, it will take less time and it costs less because all you need to do is maybe download a movie or, go and get those case files. So it's a very quick and cost-effective way of getting data. And then the accuracy of the measurement is, because it's existing data, it's already been, I suppose, vetted as credible, as reliable, so we can already take it as not necessarily at face value. Of course, it depends on the source. But if it's, example, we're taking an existing journal article, we don't really need to worry about, is this valid? Is it reliable? Because, it's been through peer review, it's been published. It means that there's a level of reliability and credibility to it. So we don't need to worry about that too much, right? So then we're told that there are a number, or the different sources of existing data. Before I go on, are there any questions? Okay, I think we're all okay then. Right, so there are different sources of existing data that we can use, and they are ranked according to how close they are to the original data. So the first one is primary data, and when we hear primary data, this is mostly what we think of, what we use when we think of our research project. So this comes directly from the original source. So the social scientists will always try to obtain access to this kind of data, right? Because it's the original data. So original data would then, primary data in this case would be the recordings of interviews, right? So it's existing. So yeah, I think just the difference is it is existing data because it's been done. Someone maybe 10 years ago interviewed people from this particular community. Now I, as a researcher in 2020, get access to those interview files, right, to those tapes. So it is existing data, but it's primary, right? So it's primary because I can still hear from the people's mouths themselves what they thought about, if it was the 2010 World Cup, right? And there are all these files and recordings about it. I can go and just collect all of those tapes and listen to them and then do my analysis from that, right? Because it's it's primary data. So it's not original data, sorry, it's primary data. And then we've got secondary data, which moves away from the original source itself a little bit. And secondary data consists of materials that come from someone other than the original source. So with that example about the 2010 World Cup, my secondary data in that case would be a report that was written on those tapes, right? So probably the report of the researcher that interviewed those people wrote a report on his interviews. So I am now using his report as my data. So that's secondary data. If I was using the direct tapes, that would be primary data. If I'm using the report based on those tapes, that is secondary data, right? And then, yeah, so we're told that because secondary data it's not from the horse's mouth, essentially, right? It's an interpretation of what the person said or what the people said, because obviously that reporter had to analyze or, interpret it in his own way to write up his report. So then it needs to be cross-checked for accuracy to ensure that what was written actually reflects what the original people said, right? And then we also have identified tertiary data, which again moves, I suppose, one step out again from the original source. So in this case, it would be maybe a movie. No, it would be let me think. I suppose a report on the report, right? So if that researcher wrote the report, that would be our secondary data, that report that he wrote. But now, if a student in this class writes a report based on that report, and I use the student's report as my data, and then that's tertiary data, right? I hope that is not too confusing. It had to just make sense in my mind as well. So we can see how that can become a problem, because it's now two interpretations of the same thing, and of course there's the risk of things getting lost in interpretation. Maybe the first researcher interpreted it correctly based on what he heard from the people he interviewed, but maybe the student added their own interpretation and translation to it. And now I'm using the student's report as my data. So that means that I'm not really getting the actual gist of what was said in that interview, right? Okay. So all of this begs or brings to for the question about authenticity and credibility of existing data. Yes, we said that we don't have to work to check it because it is published, but we do need to ensure that we have accounted for the authenticity of this data, especially if in the case of something like a tertiary data source, right? We need to check for credibility in that case and to see how accurately it reflects the original data or the source. So we ask ourselves, or the researcher really has to ask themselves certain questions when it comes to credibility of existing data. Firstly, in order to determine the authenticity of secondary and tertiary data, questions need to be asked relating to the authenticity of the person as a source. So if I'm using the report in that researcher, I first need to determine if that researcher, because he's the one who's written the report that I want to use, I need to determine if that researcher was actually close to the event, right, when it happened. And in this case, if he's the one who interviewed the people originally, then I think that gives him some credibility, right? and we, ask ourselves, is the data clear? Was the source pressurized in any way? So what did the researcher maybe pressurize these participants to answer in particular way? Was the source, did they give this information willingly, etc. But I think the most important thing here is about, yes, I'm so sorry. Yeah, is just how close the source was to what happened. Sorry, in this case we're talking about the original source, so the people who were interviewed. So yeah, the people who were interviewed, were they close to the event when it happened? Obviously, if this person lived through the 2010 World Cup, they were close to the event. Can they remember it clearly? Were they, actively involved? So basically, you want to look at the credibility of the original source, right? The people in that interview. And then we look at the credibility of the actual data or the event. So, is it original data in that we can actually hear the voices of the person, that we can actually just actually see that this is what the person said? Or is it something like a transcript, which we then won't not question, but it's a bit more removed from the original data? And is the information supported by other sources or evidence? And then we also need to ask questions about the credibility of the sources. Yes, the source, and how well they captured what the original source was trying to say. Right? How was this information recorded? What was the purpose of the information being recorded? Can the information be verified? Is the information believable? Right? So all lists are all on page 177. I'm just going to skip ahead. So that takes us to essentially our data collection methods, or our second data collection method. The first one was, of course, using existing data as data collection, and I think that it was important to get that out of the way because it's fairly straightforward. And then we'll go, surveys versus field research. So survey research can be defined as a systematic collection of specific information obtained through asking a sample of respondents the same question at a particular point in time. And we've all, I think, done surveys before. We've all filled out surveys. It can be in the form of a telephone survey, where it's, I don't know if they don't do this anymore, but they used to, they'll call you when everyone was in the yellow, was it the yellow pages or the phone book? And we're all in the phone book, and they would, have everyone's numbers and call you and ask you a bunch of questions. Or in the form of a questionnaire, which is also what we're quite familiar with now, which can be either printed or online questionnaire. So surveys basically involve investigating a large number of people who are geographically spread out over a wide area. So the point of the survey is to try to get to as many people as possible. And I think this shows us that it has tendency, or it leans towards a more quantitative research approach, because we're trying to get as much information as possible, most likely to be able to generalize most likely to be able to quantify and generalize the data at the end of the day. Right. So we are told that surveys are great because, you know, when there's a lack of time and money, especially online surveys, that really helps because it goes out a lot further with less effort, really. Once you've sort of drawn out or designed the questionnaire, you can send it to like a large number of people at the same time. Oops, sorry. Okay, so that's how the survey, and then how the survey differs from field research is that field research involves observing events and people usually in their natural settings, right? So here the researcher is actually physically going out into people's social spaces or work spaces or educational spaces to observe them in those spaces. So it can be in settings such as a prison, a clinic, a rural village, a squatter camp, a doctor's waiting room, a school, a hospital, etc., right? So anywhere where people are, any social, I suppose, social settings, that is where the researcher would go out to conduct their field research. So it's the collection of primary data in the natural environment. Just a question. Oh, I didn't see this question from you, Lizette. So I think this was when we were talking about existing data, I suppose. Okay. What if we have findings that are better than the existing data? Yeah, so I think if you have your own data, there would not really be need to use existing data unless you want to use that to compare it with what you found. So you want to say that, well, you know, this interview, whatever, showed this, but, you know, I went out and I also interviewed people and this is what I found. So you can use it to compare. But yeah, essentially, if you have your own data, there would not really be a need for the use of existing data. All right, thanks, Claire. Okay, so yes, that's what field research does. It goes out. So with surveys, we are just really mostly sending out, or they talk about, and it's very interesting. I think it shows us maybe how old the study unit is, because it talks a lot about telephone surveys, and I don't think that that's something that is done anymore. But yes, so we talked about telephone surveys and then field research there. Okay, so now in going into interviews, and I think we're going to end with interviews in the sessions. Yeah, in the session, we're going to go through interviews in there, and then in next week's session on Monday, we'll look at observation and all the other data collection methods, just because interviews, there's quite a lot here. Okay, so interviews, we know, is uses personal contact. It's an interaction really between the interviewer and the interviewee. Usually takes place face-to-face or via phone, and of course now in our day and age via online, right? It can take place online as well. And you know, they both have, so you can have, we are told, interviews as a survey and interviews and field research. So this is what we're going to look at. So and essentially the difference here being that the survey research emphasizes comparison and generalization. So that's why I said with the survey, we're trying to get as much information as possible, right? So that you can make a generalization. But with the field research, you're really trying to develop an understanding of a particular event or something that's happening, and most likely you can't get a lot of this data. It's more quality over quantity in the case of field research, because you are only one person and you can't be in 50 different communities at once, right, to do field research. So we have we have different types of interviews. Let me just... Field research is also limited because the research has to go back and forth when people are home or parent consent needed. Men won't allow their women to be interviewed alone. It's time consuming. Exactly. It's time consuming, and it is expensive. You know, if you, as the researcher, is having to travel out maybe every day to go to a particular school, first you need to get all types of clearance to even get into the school, right? You need to get consent from all the people. You need to transport to get there every day, and if it's a 3 or 6 month project, that's, you know, every day having to go there. Yeah, it really is time consuming. Even the recordings of the data, you know, is going to be so much. You'll have the positive is, of course, you'll have a lot of data at the end of the day, but the downside of it is that most times you don't end up using all of that data because it's just so much. It really is so much. I remember in my postgrad when I did field research, and I was very ambitious, and I spent a week with high school students. So I spent a week with about 8 high school students, and that was 8 weeks of traveling to whichever school they were at. I would travel to their school and spend the day with them. And at the end of those 8 weeks, I had so much data that it was so overwhelming to just, first of all, transcription was a nightmare and 2/3. And then having to really sit down and now pick out what I need from this vast amount of data. It was so much. So yeah, it really is quite a process when you're doing field research. And I think this is why it's important that you really clearly define what you want to do and not be too ambitious with it, because if someone hears that you're doing field research, they know that you're going to get a lot of data. So ideally you want to, you know, reduce the amount of time that you're going to spend in the field. Otherwise it just gets so overwhelming. Okay, so yeah, with interviews we have different types of interviews. The most common being structured and unstructured interviews. So the structured, as sort of the word says, it is structured. It's quite rigid. The interviewer basically goes in with a list of specific questions that they're going to ask, and the aim is that, you know, they get all those questions answered by the end of the session. So there isn't really a lot of room for movement. It's a very, I suppose, very formal type of interview. Yeah, very formal. You want answers to certain questions. But an unstructured interview actually allows the respondents to give their reaction on general issues in the absence of specific questions. So yes, of course the researcher will still go in with questions because you must be prepared, but you're not sticking too tightly to the list of questions. Essentially, it's a flexible type of design, if you remember on our session on research design. So an unstructured interview will form part of a flexible research design, because you understand that even though you have your questions, something might come up in the interview that wasn't part of your questions, but that actually gives you more insight into what you're trying to find out about the participant. So the participant mentions something, you know, the researcher then has the flexibility to say, oh, tell me more about that, even though it's not part of the, you know, it's not on the list, but they realize that it will add value to the data that they're trying to collect. So you are open to that possibility. Right, and then we've got in-depth interviews, and these are also called intensive interviews, and they are a form of unstructured interviews. Actually, I think that you can clump in-depth interviews and unstructured interviews in a way. In that in-depth, as it says, it's really trying to get in depth. So you really want to find out how this participant feels about something, what their opinions are, what their emotions are, why they think a particular way. So it's not just, do you like this? It's like, do you like this? Oh, tell me why. Oh, but why? So, you see, you're actually trying to probe and go a little bit deeper and get to like the core of this person's understanding or this person's opinion on something. So yeah, it's very useful in field research because you get that full understanding of the person's motivation of a particular phenomenon. And then we've got focus group interviews. And focus group interviews are also called group interviews. And they consist usually of about 6 to 12 people who are basically interviewed together, right? It's a group interview, so everyone is interviewed together. And it is normally semi-structured or totally unstructured and guided by a discussion leader or moderator. So you get people in a room and you're basically asking questions and, everyone has a chance to reply. And the positive thing about group interviews or focus group interviews is that, sometimes we draw from other people's responses. So if they are asked something about, what's your opinion on the lockdown, and this person, you all have your initial responses, but someone says something that makes you remember something like, oh yeah, I also realized this. So you're able to get quite a rich discussion, and you're able to get different opinions on a particular issue. The negative of this, of course, is again this thing of, we want to be socially acceptable in our responses. So if I'm in a group of people, I'm going to most likely not be very comfortable to say, oh, I think that, I don't know, the DA should come into power, or something that would be seen as controversial, right? So because of the presence of other people, you might find that people end up changing their views or just agreeing with everyone else in the room because they don't want to be that one that is sort of left out or looking kind of crazy. So that's the negative. We are not told how a researcher can minimize this, but I think it's just one of those things that you don't really have control over. This is the thing with social science research. When we are working with people, we really can't predict how people will act, how people will respond. I think it's just for the researcher to make a note of it, that in every instance, this is all dependent on the assumption that the participant was actually sharing their real feelings and their real opinions. Okay, so we're told then that focus group interviews usually don't stand on their own. I mean, they can, but you can't combine them with other data collection methods. And this is actually what I did. I spent the week with the participants in their schools, and then after that, so that was my observation, right, period. And then after that, I actually got all of them together in a room, and then conducted a focus group discussion. And what this allows you to do is to then bring up the things that you've observed during those weeks, or and bring it to the table, and see what people think about it. It's like, oh, so for example, I mentioned that, oh, at one of you guys' schools, I noticed this. What do you think about that? And then everyone can sort of give their opinions or discussions on this thing that came up during observation. So it's a nice way to sort of add to your data to really layer it, because in the observation you just observed, but now with a focus group you can get the opinions on the observations, and not just from one person, but the general group. So that's yeah, that is how focus group interviews can be combined with other data collection methods. Yeah, or you could do, a focus group and then do an individual interview after that to see if the people's opinions or if their answers will change from when they were in a group setting to when they are in a one-on-one setting. You're welcome. Thanks, Lizette. Okay. Cool. And then we have types of questions. So we've mentioned now, and I think we're going to close soon. I'm just mindful of time. So yes, we mentioned that with the interviews, especially unstructured interviews, they really give you the opportunity to allow to ask the respondent more questions, to dig a little deeper. I think there's a song called Dig a Little Deeper. Yes, so there are different types of questions that we can ask in interviews. I suppose the most straightforward or simple one being your closed-ended questions. And this we know is just the yes-no questions. And I think that we would find these in mostly structured interviews, but even unstructured interviews, of course, would have yes-no questions. But mostly questions that doesn't really require explanation, you just want to know yes or no. So the example that we are given in the study unit is, if you ask a participant, do you smoke dagga, then yes or no, and you leave it at that and you move on to the next question. So we are told that it's better to avoid it's better to avoid a long list of answer options, right? Unless we are confident that the respondent will be familiar with all of the answers. So yes, no question, close-ended question in this regard, we're thinking about like not multiple choice, but if you're giving people an option, right? You're asking them, what political parties do you support? Right, that's a closed-ended question because you only need a fixed number of answers, right? But in this case, it's important to then make sure that you list all the possible answers, because if a person sees, well, the IFP is not on the list and this is one of the parties that I support, then that becomes an issue. Sorry, let me just... section we still used it. Yes, Amy, maybe I'll just touch on that when we wrap up, which should be in the next 4 minutes. Okay, so those are your closed-ended questions. I think we're quite familiar with them. And then the open questions are those which we do like in social science research, because it encourages the respondents to really express their attitudes, their emotions, their ideas, and their opinions about a certain thing in their own words. So open-ended questions, of course, we know is like something like, what are your views on affirmative action? It gives the participants the opportunity to really talk through their opinions, talk through their feelings about this particular thing without any restrictions. But if we ask them, do you like affirmative action? And you get a yes, no answer, there's not much more there that you can do with, right? If you're needing to analyze something like that, it becomes very difficult from a qualitative research point of view. But how you can then change that is then saying that, do you like affirmative action, yes or no? And then follow that up with a follow-up question, which is, I think I've just jumped now, but the follow-up question is like, why? and that then gives you, that opens the question up and gives the participants an opportunity to actually explain and to express the issues around that. Okay, so we've also got free narration questions, which allows which invites the participant to really narrate their story or their experience about a particular thing. So this is something I used a lot as well in my interviews or in my focus groups discussions, where I ask them, tell me about your first day at school, so and that's a nice way to sort of start off an interview or a focus group, because it warms the participant up. They're able to really reflect on, okay, my first day of school, I was really nervous, I didn't have friends or whatever. And from there, you can then pull questions as you go. So free narration questions are also very good to really get to understand the inner workings of this person. And then we've got role-playing questions, which, as the name suggests, it's another variation of open questions, but here the respondent is invited to play a particular role and respond from the perspective of that role. So it's like, oh, so if you were a teacher at your school and the students, were doing this, what would you do? And that really allows them to sort of get out of their own shoes as a student or as a learner, and try to get into the shoes of a teacher and, say, oh, maybe I would also be upset and whatever. So yeah, role-playing also helps you to also see the thinking, or to work through the thought process of the participant. So those are also very good in unstructured interviews. So all of these open questions are great ways of getting, or different ways of getting this more inner details, or the opinions and the attitudes out of respondents without necessarily asking them. Sometimes when you ask people, how do you feel about this, they might not respond as openly, or it might take them a while. But if you ask them a free narration, or tell me about if this, or tell me how you would feel if this happened, that's also another way of just getting them to open up. All right, so I think that was it. Oh no, there's more. I think I'm gonna wrap up here because of time. So on Monday, we will continue with conducting an interview, sort of just the things to take note of. I don't think we're not going to go into too much detail here. Yeah, but we're going to run through it before we move to part 2. Actually, I think it was only 2 slides left. So conducting an interview and the advantages and limitations of conducting interviews. Yes, so we'll do that on Monday, but I will encourage you to read up on it if you haven't yet, so that it's not new to us as we go through it, and that we're really just revising as we are in the session, and then we will move on to observation in field research versus observation in surveys, I believe. Yeah, and then we'll wrap up Unit 7 on Monday. Ooh, that is supposed to be Unit 7. Sorry there, not 87. Unit 7, Part 2 on Monday. Okay, that is my bad. Yes, are there any questions before we go? All right. Thanks, Lizette. Cool. So, Amy, you submitted a form for consultation. We will do it on MS Teams if that is most suitable for you. If it's not, then we can chat through an alternative. But if MS Teams works, then we'll do that. So I'll check that out, and I'll schedule something. We'll schedule something for today's Wednesday, so maybe Friday or next week. let's just see how we can do that. Okay, to everyone else, thank you so much. If you also do want to schedule a one-on-one consultation, please feel free to do so. The link is in the chat. And yes, all the best and have a great weekend. I'll see you on Monday.